In December 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, sending shockwaves across the globe and igniting deep concern in Washington. The world watched as Soviet tanks rolled across the border, marking a dramatic escalation in the Cold War. The invasion was headline news everywhere, and for the United States it was a wake-up call. The Soviets were now positioned dangerously close to the Persian Gulf, a region whose vast oil reserves were critical to the global economy and Western interests. The move threatened to expand Soviet influence into the heart of the Middle East, raising fears that the balance of power could tip in Moscow's favor and jeopardize access to vital energy resources. For the U.S., still reeling from the painful withdrawal from Vietnam and the shock of the Iranian Revolution, this was more than just another crisis. It was a direct challenge to American credibility and influence. The Cold War was a global struggle, often fought through proxy wars in distant lands. Afghanistan, a country at the crossroads of empires, was about to become the next, and perhaps most consequential, battleground. President Carter called the invasion the gravest threat to peace since World War II, marking a dramatic shift to a more confrontational U.S. policy. The stakes, he warned, could not be higher. America's goal was clear: contain Soviet expansion and prevent a domino effect that could destabilize the entire region, threatening allies and interests far beyond Afghanistan's borders. Direct military action was off the table. The risk of nuclear war between the superpowers was simply too high. The world could not afford such a catastrophic escalation. Instead, the U.S. turned to covert action, arming and training Afghan resistance fighters, known as the Mujahideen, in a secret effort to bleed the Red Army and bog them down in a costly, unwinnable conflict. The plan was simple but ruthless: turn Afghanistan into the Soviet Union's Vietnam, a draining and demoralizing quagmire that would sap Moscow's strength and resolve. Operation Cyclone was born, setting the stage for one of the largest and most expensive covert operations in CIA history, with billions of dollars funneled into the Afghan resistance. The secret war in Afghanistan was about to begin, forever altering the course of the Cold War, and the fate of a nation caught in the crossfire. The CIA's mission was clear: support the Afghan resistance at all costs, but do so from the shadows. The stakes were high. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan threatened to tip the balance of the Cold War, and the U.S. needed a way to respond without triggering a direct confrontation. Every move had to be calculated, every action deniable, while keeping America's role hidden from both the Soviets and the world. Operation Cyclone relied on intermediaries, with Pakistan's ISI as the main conduit for all aid. The CIA funneled resources through Pakistan, trusting the ISI to distribute weapons and funds to the Afghan Mujahideen. This partnership allowed the U.S. to deny involvement and gave Pakistan significant influence over the war's direction, shaping which resistance groups received support and how the conflict unfolded. Early support was modest. Old Soviet bloc weapons sourced from third countries, keeping American fingerprints off the operation. These arms were smuggled across treacherous borders, often under the cover of night. The goal was simple but ambitious: harass Soviet forces, keep the resistance alive, and signal to Moscow that Afghanistan would not be an easy conquest. The Mujahideen, armed and emboldened, became a thorn in the side of the Red Army. As the war dragged on, U.S. support escalated: more money, more weapons, and more sophisticated technology. The CIA began supplying advanced anti-aircraft missiles, shifting the balance on the battlefield. Saudi Arabia joined as a key partner, matching U.S. funding dollar for dollar. This financial alliance doubled the resources available to the Afghan fighters and deepened the international dimension of the conflict. The CIA's blueprint was flexible, adapting to the changing realities on the ground. Field operatives and analysts constantly revised their strategies to counter Soviet tactics. The operation grew into a global effort, with international partners supplying arms and funds. Networks stretched from Washington to Riyadh, Islamabad to London, creating a web of covert support. The plan was to wage a proxy war, draining Soviet resources and morale. The Red Army found itself bogged down in a conflict with no clear end. Operation Cyclone became a model for covert action: effective, deniable, and far-reaching. Its success would inspire future intelligence operations around the world, but the complexity of the coalition would have lasting consequences, as competing interests and rivalries simmered beneath the surface. The secret blueprint was in motion, setting the stage for a conflict that would reshape the region and the world for decades to come. Operation Cyclone's success depended on a shadowy supply chain, a vast and secretive network that stretched across borders and operated in the shadows of global politics. At the very heart of this network was Pakistan's ISI, the powerful intelligence agency that became the main conduit for foreign support. Weapons and supplies arrived in Pakistan on unmarked planes, often landing at remote airstrips under the cover of darkness to avoid detection. From there, the cargo was moved to ISI-controlled depots near the Afghan border, where it was stored and sorted for distribution. The ISI decided which Mujahideen groups received aid, acting as the gatekeeper for all foreign assistance. They often favored groups that were closely aligned with Pakistan's own interests, shaping the resistance according to their strategic goals. Supplies then traveled by truck and mule, winding through treacherous mountain routes and dangerous passes into Afghanistan, where the terrain itself was a constant threat. Mujahideen commanders negotiated with ISI handlers in Peshawar, sometimes bargaining for more weapons or better equipment. Once on the move, they risked ambushes, theft, and betrayal on the perilous journey back to their bases. The decentralized system was chaotic and unpredictable, but it kept the resistance armed and fighting against the Soviets. The US had little control over where its aid ended up, with American officials often kept at arm's length from the actual operations. Instead, they relied on ISI reports and priorities, trusting their partner to manage the flow of weapons and money. This gave Pakistan enormous leverage, and allowed radical Islamist factions to rise, shifting the balance of power within the resistance. The pipeline fueled the war, but it also shaped Afghanistan's future in unpredictable and often dangerous ways, setting the stage for decades of conflict. The covert flow of weapons and money was both the operation's greatest strength and its most dangerous risk, creating opportunities for corruption and unintended consequences. The consequences of these choices would echo for decades, shaping the lives of millions and altering the course of history in the region. Soviet air power dominated the Afghan battlefield, with Hind helicopters terrorizing the Mujahideen. The resistance's old anti-aircraft weapons were useless against these flying tanks. The war was at a stalemate, until the US decided to escalate. In 1986, the CIA introduced the FIM-92 Stinger missile, a portable, heat-seeking anti-aircraft weapon. The Stinger changed everything. Soviet pilots were suddenly vulnerable, and aircraft losses soared. Morale among the Mujahideen skyrocketed, while Soviet air tactics became cautious and less effective. The Stinger is widely seen as the war's turning point, leveling the playing field and forcing the Soviets onto the defensive. The Red Army's losses became unsustainable, hastening their decision to withdraw. A single advanced weapon, strategically deployed, had shifted the entire conflict. The Stinger's impact was both military and psychological. The balance of power had finally tipped. Operation Cyclone was a global effort, with the US and Saudi Arabia at its core. Congress secretly authorized hundreds of millions annually, matched dollar for dollar by the Saudis. Saudi support brought not just money, but also foreign volunteers, including Osama bin Laden. The UK, China, and Egypt contributed weapons and expertise, further muddying the operation's origins. This multinational alliance transformed the Mujahideen into a formidable force. The coalition's shared interests masked deep differences and set the stage for future complications. The secret alliance was the engine of the Afghan war. The Mujahideen were a fractured mix of tribal, ethnic, and ideological factions. The ISI, with CIA backing, funneled most aid to the most radical Islamist groups, believing them to be the most effective fighters. Leaders like Gulbuddin Hekmatyar and Jalaluddin Haqqani received the lion's share of weapons and funding. More moderate and traditionalist groups were sidelined, fueling internal rivalries. The focus was on short-term military gains, not the long-term political future of Afghanistan. The CIA's hands-off approach meant little oversight of who was armed or how the war was fought. The US relied on ISI reports, often biased toward Pakistan's interests. This strategy empowered extremists and set the stage for future instability. The choices made during the war would haunt Afghanistan for decades. The holy warriors were effective, but the cost was high. By the late 1980s, the Soviet war in Afghanistan was a disaster, costly, unpopular, and unwinnable. Gorbachev recognized the need to withdraw, and in 1989, the last Soviet troops left Afghanistan. For the US and CIA, it was a Cold War triumph. Operation Cyclone had achieved its goal, but victory brought chaos. The communist regime in Kabul soon collapsed, and the Mujahideen factions turned on each other. Civil war erupted, devastating Kabul and plunging the country into anarchy. With the Soviets gone, US interest evaporated, aid was cut, and Afghanistan was abandoned. The power vacuum left behind fueled endless violence and destruction. The infrastructure was shattered and warlords battled for control. The US had won the proxy war but lost the peace. The seeds of future conflict were sown in the ruins. Afghanistan's tragedy was just beginning. The cost of victory was steep. Operation Cyclone's unintended legacy was the rise of the Taliban. After the Soviet-backed government fell, Afghanistan descended into civil war and chaos. The Taliban, many former Mujahideen, emerged from religious schools, promising order and strict Islamic rule. Supported by Pakistan's ISI, they seized Kabul in 1996 and sheltered al-Qaeda. The networks and weapons built to fight the Soviets now empowered new extremists. The blowback was devastating. Al-Qaeda, led by Osama bin Laden, planned the 9/11 attacks from Taliban-controlled Afghanistan. The US was forced to return, this time to fight the very forces it had once armed. The operation's short-term success had long-term, tragic consequences. The story of Operation Cyclone became a cautionary tale of unintended outcomes. The ghosts of the secret war would haunt the world for decades. Operation Cyclone was both a Cold War victory and a strategic failure. It showed the power of covert action, but also the dangers of short-sightedness. The focus on defeating the Soviets ignored the need for post-war stability. Outsourcing the war to Pakistan's ISI empowered extremists and undermined Afghanistan's future. The risks of arming proxies became clear as weapons and training fueled new conflicts. Without a long-term plan, military success turned to chaos and blowback. Operation Cyclone's legacy is a warning. Secret wars rarely end when the shooting stops. Victory without a vision for peace is no victory at all.